Welcome to World at Work TV. I'm Alison Avalos, and I'm joined today by Samantha Smith of Fluor Corporation and Rebecca Toman of Meyer, and we're talking about using workplace flexibility as a business strategy. Rebecca, you've got some recent data in this space. What is your data saying about the use of workplace flexibility?
Well, we just published a new survey on workplace flexibility practices in the U.S., and we've got 126 leading organizations that submitted data, large companies like IBM, Fluor, and Adobe. And the first thing we wanted to know is whether workplace flexibility and work-life balance is a part of the culture at these organizations. And this can be something that's a little bit challenging to quantify, but we attempted to do so by asking the firms whether they have any formal documentation in the firm that mentions work-life balance. And we found that 41% of organizations do mention work-life balance or flexibility in their some kind of statement. And this indicates that their firms have a culture that embraces work-life balance. We also found that about 70% of firms do offer telecommuting to at least some employees. And the 30% that don't provide telecommuting, they tended to be in more customer-focused industries like retail banking or healthcare. So we found that in general, where telecommuting is feasible, organizations are offering it to at least some extent.
So let's talk a little bit about the business advantage to organizations, because the use of flexibility can be a great strategy to improving your ability to attract, retain, and motivate your employees, but also keep finance happy at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, one thing we did ask in the survey is whether firms were using flexibility as a tool to attract and recruit employees. And we were surprised to find out that only a quarter of firms are routinely using it. And in my opinion, this can definitely be a missed opportunity because flexibility is such an attractive benefit to employees.
Samantha, Fluor operates in a variety of different disciplines. Talk a little bit about how your organization has thought about the use of flexibility and really ingraining this in your culture when you're involved in so many different things.
Just for some background, Alison, we have about 65,000 employees working in 85 countries. So by virtue of that, and the work that we do is engineering and construction, a lot of the work is done outside the office. So it's somewhat inherent within the type of work that we do that you are going to be on a project site, you are going to be away from an office in many of the functions. However, we also, just to formalize it, added some documentation to our global HR policy that governs all employees in all of the countries that we do work in, that we specifically talked about how work-life, we call it effectiveness, is really a benefit both to employees as well as organizations, and so it's instilled into our global HR policy and philosophy. So you kind of see it and act it and embrace it every day.
So talk a little bit about some of the differences in programs when you look at the U.S. versus globally.
So the U.S. was really where the pilot was, and interestingly enough, it was actually driven out of a need to reduce facility costs in some particular offices in the United States. So it was extremely formalized, and it specifically started with a couple of groups. So by virtue of needing to reduce some facility costs, essentially that was initially one of the drivers for a formalized program in the United States. In the U.S., we have a formalized programs where we actually have a teleworking agreement. The telework policy that's in the U.S., again, is specifically just for U.S. workers, and it's really driven by a company-initiated agreement where we are asking the employees to be mobile. So above and beyond that, a lot of it is more just employee to manager, department to department, and basically agreements and flexibility around what the individual employees and departments and also business require.
We often hear from organizations that the use of flexibility maybe can't be universally applied within an organization because of the type of work that's being done. Can you talk a little bit about some of the differences between the disciplines and how your organization has managed that so that there's a fair perception on the use of these programs?
Right, yeah, fair and consistency is two of the biggest words that we always use, because if you're fair and consistent, it's really difficult to have people kind of throw arrows at it, both from an employee standpoint, but it's negotiable and it's not necessarily permanent. So sometimes a department will go into it. It may depend on the software that they use. There may be cybersecurity issues. From a safety perspective, some of our clients may or may not necessarily welcome working from home for particular reasons. So it really depends on the country, it depends on the business, it depends on the function, and sometimes it depends on the person. Some people may go into a potential working from home situation with all the best intentions and thinking that it's fantastic not only for their function, but for their department and for their personality. And then it maybe just doesn't necessarily work out. But then you just work through it and amend it, and vice versa. The opposite happens as well.
So let's shift over a little bit to talking about results. What have been some of the benefits of focusing on flexibility of Fluor?
Well, you mentioned finance, keeping finance happy. It's a definite decrease in facility costs in some respects. In many cases, it has to do with you are getting rid of this office space, so everybody needs to work somewhere other than a designated office space. And as you know, that obviously facility costs vary around the world, so in some cases those savings can be pretty big. From a flexibility in terms of an employee morale standpoint, I think it's a necessity now, because we've really gone away from the traditional everybody comes into an office, sits there, goes to meetings, and is in one physical place for 40 hours a week between these hours and these hours. That medium and that environment doesn't necessarily work not only for everybody, but also for every company. And we have the benefit of technology to be able to facilitate that. We do a lot of calls with people around the world, and most of our colleagues are not necessarily in our office. And so you have the benefit of being able to work around doctor's appointments or child care, or in some cases dependent care issues. In many cases, just the ability to be able to work from home, to be there for a delivery, can make all the difference in the world to some folks. And it's really that there's not a big cost to the company, but you get so many returns.
Right, and I found that really the biggest cost savings can come with the reduced turnover. And flexibility can be a very attractive tool to retain employees, and I'm a great example of that, because after my 5th anniversary with the firm, my husband's job with the Air Force required us to move from Boston to Washington, D.C. And I thought that I better start looking for a job in D.C., but my firm asked me to stay on as a remote employee, which I gladly did because I liked the work, had a great manager, and I had plenty of professional development opportunities. Fast forward to today, I just had my 11th anniversary with the firm. So I'm just one example of many of how flexibility can be a very powerful retention tool.
Absolutely. And we know from a lot of the data that many organizations have embraced flexibility. But I think going back to your original points, Rebecca, about it really being a flexible culture, talk a little bit about any advice you might have for organizations who probably have some form of flexibility available within their organization to at least some employees. But for those who are really looking to move along that continuum and really get to a place where it is ingrained in their culture and they're getting the biggest bang for that investment.
Well, they certainly need to have the support from top management and just to make a conscious decision that flexibility is something that is going to be important for their culture, because it doesn't work in all organizations. Some organizations are more conservative and their culture is where they want everybody to be in the office 5 days a week. So organization culture is a big driver.
And to that point, don't assume anything and over-communicate. I'm a firm believer in there is no such thing as over-communication. So if expectations and clear roles and responsibilities are made clear up front to the manager as well as to the employee, whether through it's a formalized policy or a conversation, but again, fairness and consistency. And Rebecca talked about retention tools. I think a lot of people, while we don't necessarily put it in writing, yes, workplace flexibility is an option, we find that most of the time, if and when an employee or a candidate brings it up, 9 times out of 10 we can typically accommodate it, unless there's a business reason or potentially a performance issue that you need to work around or work through. But most of the time, I think a lot of it is the employees don't necessarily even realize that they can ask it, and particularly if you're a candidate, because you don't necessarily want to look at that as a roadblock. to becoming an employee. So it's something that's there for the asking, and it's such a, I'll say, cheap benefit.
Well, and back to your point about the importance of communication, probably from that first meeting with potential employees.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the cons or aspects that an organization might find leading them away further embracing flexibility, maybe some of the perceptions that exist, and then what an organization can do to address those.
I think a lot of people have a lot of stereotypes. In some cases they think, well, they'll be distracted the entire time, they'll never get anything done. In some cases we found the opposite was true. Sometimes they would burn out. Some of the other challenges is potentially looking at technology. While technology is a huge, huge benefit to all of us in so many ways, one of the nice things is that it really encourages more communication between the employee and the manager because it's so, so critical. So managers really have to keep an additional eye towards communicating and checking in with their employees because they don't see them, and that goes for the employee as well.
And some managers are resistant to telecommuting and remote work because they worry that their employees are going to be at the beach or they're going to have their child on their lap. And I can say from experience that's definitely a false stereotype. When I started working from home, I didn't have any children. Now I have 4, and I've actually moved my office outside of our home into a different outbuilding so that I don't have those distractions. And also gives me some balance. When I'm done with my work and I go in the house, I can be fully present for my family.
Thank you both. For World at Work TV, I'm Alison Avalos.